Welcome and welcome and welcome. I am definitely excited that we're going to go through this journey together. Let's start with the course overview, what we're going to talk about throughout this course. First off, this is Winter 25 ready. We'll be using the features that are available in the Winter 25 release. It may have been released already in your org. It may not have been. We'll be using a nonprofit cloud trial org that has Winter 25 features in it. Let's start with the topics that we'll have. First, we're going to start with how to learn flows. I believe that the best way to learn is to practice, and that's why we have a ton of use cases as part of this course. We'll talk about when to use flows and when to not use flows. We'll talk about the different flow types, the screen flows to collect user input, triggered flows to do some logic when something happens, schedule triggered flows to run on a certain schedule or interval, auto-launched flows mainly for subflows. It's used for other purposes. And this is a way to group logic together to reuse logic. We'll also talk about platform events, when to use them, and we'll also talk about platform event triggered flows. We'll talk about development lifecycle. We don't just like jump into flows and build right away. We need to design and we need to do some discovery. We'll talk about the importance of data model and why we need it and why we need to understand relationships. We'll talk about context, and by context I mean the context of record triggered flows, as in before save and after save. Does it commit to the database? Does it not? When to use this one? When to use the other? And I'm also referring to the context of the context of the flow. Is it running in system context or is it running in user context? We'll also talk about transactions. When does the transaction start and when does it end? When does the logic start and end? We'll talk about synchronous and asynchronous processing, when to use each one of them and why this is useful. We'll talk about elements and resources. We'll also cover global variables. This is a resource that's available to you to use whenever you want, something like a flow and current date. We'll talk about functions and formulas, operators such as equals and greater than and less than. We'll talk about custom error and is it going to replace validation rules. We'll send an email from inside the flow, and you can also use Lightning email templates and custom email templates to send from inside the flow as well. We'll launch a screen flow from a quick action, launch a flow from a list view button. We'll talk about screen components. We'll cover errors, and whenever an error happens, I don't stop the recording. I actually debug the error. We debug the error together. We read the debug logs together. We resolve it together, so that we share the error, the frustration, the thought process, and so on. Unless it takes forever to resolve the error, then I just like stop the recording until I figure it out. I'll look at debug and debug logs. We'll talk about flow access. Just talked about that. Is it in system context or user context? There are some interesting settings in process automation settings that we'll also look at. We'll talk about test cases. There is positive and negative test cases. It's usually we ignore negative test cases, but it is as important as positive test cases. We'll talk about rolling back logic so that it doesn't commit to the database. We'll talk about integrations with HTTP callout to connect and communicate with external systems. We'll also talk a little bit about custom metadata to store some information outside of the flow and make it admin accessible. We'll talk about scheduled jobs and scheduled tasks and how to monitor them and where to use them. We'll talk about the infamous mixed DML error on setup and non-setup objects. We'll talk about screen visibility. Reactivity on screens, where you do something on the screen and then on the same screen something reacts to that first thing. We'll talk about third-party applications like data fetcher and unofficial Salesforce. Amazing tools, amazing components that on almost every org I install them. Data fetcher works very well with reactivity and on-screen queries. Unofficial Salesforce gives you some custom buttons and custom data tables. We'll look at all of this. We'll see how to perform a SOQL query, Salesforce object query language at a very basic level, and then we'll also use Salesforce Inspector. to run these SoQL queries. You can perform this in many different ways. We'll talk about hard coding and how it is bad and horrible. We'll look at how we can run a flow as another user in order to test with the permissions and sharing of that user. We'll talk about governance limits, of course, like how to avoid governance limits, how to build efficient and performant flows. We'll look at Flow Trigger Explorer. This is a way to order record triggered flows, which one runs before the other. We'll talk about versions, the limit of versions, how to delete versions, how to save as a new version and a new flow. We'll also talk about failed flow interviews. That when you receive an email, there's a button that opens the failed flow interview to see a visual debug, not just a written debug. We'll also look at error handling, and I like to think of error handling as two pieces: preventing errors and fault pass, not just fault pass. And I like to think that preventing errors is way more important than fault pass. We'll be talking more about that. We'll be talking about naming convention, personal preferences, perhaps, and then we'll talk about the concept of separation of concerns. So these are the topics, but then like the foundation and like the most important thing is the use case. So we'll definitely explain the theory and all of these topics in some recordings, and then during the use cases we'll explain topics again and why we're using them in this use case. So the use cases are like extremely important. We have a ton of use cases. We'll have a situation where we want to send an email to a donor when we receive a gift. Email a donor from a quick action button manually, and then email donors in bulk. At the surface, these sound like very similar, but technically the approach is absolutely and significantly different. We'll see how to build a volunteer application form and send a reminder on gift transaction due date. For every one of those use cases, there is a ton of elements and resources and features that we'll be using. We'll see how to send a welcome email to a new donor, how to know that this is a new donor. We'll also see how to send a weekly summary to a development manager, and we'll set up tiers, as in something like a small donor and a major donor, how to know that this is a small donor, how to know that this is a major donor, perform aggregates, and perform collections and collection filters and sorting and things like that. We'll also see how we can send a survey link after a certain amount of time to learn about the scheduled pass. We'll have segmentation by amount range on gift transactions or donations for the purposes of using something like a collection filter. We'll automate relationships. We're using the record triggered flows there. We'll then have a project, an intake process project with a solution. This one is fairly large. There's a ton going on with this project. And then we will see how to create Experience Cloud users automatically. And this is where we could see things like the mixed DML error, how to work with setup and non-setup objects. We'll integrate with MailChimp with HTTP callout. And for every one of those use cases, there is a challenge. So there is the problem. Every one of the use cases has a user story and an acceptance criteria. And then we have the solution, and then we have a challenge. For the challenge, I don't give you the solution for the challenge, but this is an extra step that you can take where you could experiment, do some research. If you stumble into errors or problems, you could troubleshoot. We can also communicate about this on Slack, and we can talk about any of those challenges on the during our office hours. And then the last thing is a final project. This is the also another intake process, and similar to the send the emails. At the surface, it might sound similar, but the approach is absolutely different, and there is so many things that we can learn from this. And that final project is going to cover a lot of the things that we cover throughout the course, so that you can put everything together. This is everything. This is the course overview. Definitely excited to have you, and let's get started.